Today, we continue our look at the 2004 presidential election. To see part one of our look at this election or our earlier videos on the 1992, 1996, or 2000 presidential elections, click the links in the descriptions. To briefly recap, John Kerry spent much of 2003 as a middle-tier candidate. Then, in January of 2004, things fell into place for him. Howard Dean and Dick Gephardt were beating each other up in Iowa, while Joe Lieberman and Wesley Clark pulled out of the state. Kerry gave the most effective speech of his career shortly before the caucus, and it went viral. He pulled off a huge upset and got a lot of positive press. Dean, on the other hand, gave a poorly executed concession speech, and that went viral, and he got a lot of negative press. Kerry then beat Dean in New Hampshire and got momentum nationally. The primary calendar that year was so compressed that there was no time for anybody to halt Kerry's momentum. Kerry won largely based on an electability argument based on his military experience. He had a hard time explaining his voting record, and his policy proposals were pretty standard Democratic ideas. And he now faced Bush in the general election as the two major party candidates. Now, Bush and Kerry, incidentally, were both Yale graduates and had both been members of the Skull and Bone Society. So they both kind of had a bit of that New England old money, ties to them. And now they would face each other in two different parties in this presidential election. After several years of budget surpluses, the federal budget would be in deficit again. Now, this was to be expected, I think. If you have the September 11th attacks followed by two wars, you're probably going to run some budget deficits. But that being said, Bush could have made more of an effort to at least lower those deficits, and he really didn't try to do so. Prior to the September 11th attacks and the two wars, he had enacted a very large tax cut. Now, he made no effort to cancel that tax cut, even as the need for more revenue became apparent. And this, I think, contrasts from prior eras in American history where there were wars occurring and the American people were asked to contribute. I think that this helped the American spirit as it brought everybody together as they all felt that they were part of a broader effort. And Bush had a lot of political capital after the September 11th attacks. His popularity was high, and people were ready to rally behind him. He could have used that capital to ask people to contribute and to be realistic about the spending needed, especially being the fact that pretty soon baby boomers would be retiring, and this would put more pressure on the deficits, and they would go up even further moving forward. But he really didn't use that political capital to stick his neck out and to ask people to contribute more in taxes, despite the need for more money and more revenue. John Kerry is going to pick John Edwards as his running mate. This will be the first time since 1980 that a presidential candidate from a major party will pick a primary rival as his running mate. Usually, primary rivals are considered to be the running mates, but often they end up being passed over for somebody else. And in each election that we've looked at in this series, that ended up being the case. If you think about it, they never picked their primary rivals in, say, the 1992, 96, or 2000 elections. But here, Kerry does pick Edwards. And Edwards was a senator from North Carolina. He was young, and he had a working class background, often describing himself as a son of a mill worker. He was probably acceptable to most factions of the Democratic Party, and was perhaps a good pick because his policy positions were pretty similar to Kerry's, but his style was a bit different. He appealed to a different demographic, so he might have been one of the better choices out there. So let's look at some midsummer polls. We see some polls from late July, early to mid-August, and we see Kerry, is pretty strong in these polls. He's got the lead in several of them. There's a tie in two of them. We see Bush with the lead in only one of these polls. So Kerry is in a pretty good position going into midsummer. Now, this would be prior to the Republican convention. But it looks here like Kerry is running pretty strong in these midsummer polls. In the prior elections we looked at, we saw the smaller parties nominate well-known candidates like Ralph Nader, Pat Buchanan, and Ross Perot in some of the elections. In 2008, which we haven't gotten to yet, both the Libertarian Party and the Green Party will nominate candidates who had been members of Congress from the Republican and Democratic parties respectively, kind of disgruntled members of those parties who decided to branch out and join these smaller parties. But sandwiched in between, those things happening in the 90s and 2000 and what we would see in 2008. We have this 2004 election here where each of these smaller parties would pick nominees that were not exactly household names. These parties often have internal debates when they're picking their nominees about whether or not it's better to pick a better known candidate who can generate some media attention for the party, but may not see eye to eye with the party on all of their philosophies. And they may not be the best advocate for the party as they're getting that attention. Or should they nominate a party stalwart who may be lesser known, but who fully embraces the party's vision? So in this 2004 election, this can be a base point that we can look at to compare to other elections to try to figure out what's most effective. So we're going to see the Libertarian Party nominate a gentleman named Michael Badnarik. The Constitution Party is going to nominate Michael Peroutka, and the Green Party is going to nominate David Cobb. So each of these will be, I guess you can call them party stalwarts who are true blue believers in the party philosophies, but not particularly well known to the general American public. So I want to talk about a major reason why Bush trailed in a lot of those polls that we were looking at. So when he originally pitched this war in Iraq, the whole basis for the war and why he said we needed to go was that Saddam Hussein posed an imminent threat because he was developing chemical and biological weapons. However, once the war happened and Saddam Hussein got deposed, the U.S. forces looked for these weapons and did not find them. And it became apparent that the whole basis for the war was wrong and that Bush's intelligence had made an error. There didn't end up being weapons of mass destruction, no chemical or biological weapons to speak of. And this really hurt Bush's standing. Although nuclear weapons were not the central part of Bush's argument for going to the Iraq War, he did make a passing reference in his State of the Union address in the lead up to the war that Saddam Hussein was taking steps to acquire enriched uranium from the African country of Niger, and this one day could lead to him having nuclear weapons. A diplomat named Joe Wilson, who had experience in Iraq and Africa as a diplomat, had been asked to look into the uranium matter, and he determined that the intelligence was faulty, and he reported to the White House that he didn't believe that there was this exchange between Niger and Iraq. Nevertheless, Bush would discuss the uranium deal in his State of the Union address. This prompted Wilson to write a New York Times op-ed stating that Bush went ahead and talked about this despite having reason to believe that the intelligence was faulty. Although this didn't deal with the central part of the case for the war, in the minds of many Americans, not all made the distinction between nuclear and chemical and biological weapons. And since none of the weapons were found anyway, the fact that Bush was willing to disregard Joe Wilson's report it left many to wonder whether he might have disregarded other information that he shouldn't have. Meanwhile, Kerry was dealing with his own political problems, having had a rather wishy-washy position on the war. When Bush asked for additional funding for the war, Kerry voted for a proposal to grant the funding so long as it was paid for by taxing the incomes of wealthy earners and eliminating the part of the Bush tax cuts that went to those higher bracketed voters. He voted against a version that didn't have that provision. This led to a quote that was repeated in many of Bush's ads, where Kerry said, "I voted for the $87 billion before I voted against it." Because of Kerry's earlier cop-out on the Iraq War vote, where he said that he voted to authorize it but didn't support it, he had a reputation for not standing behind his principles. And this quote only reinforced that image. So a little bit more on things that could add to the budget deficit. So we had talked about there being a tax cut, 2 wars, a looming demographic problem with large baby boom population about to become eligible for Social Security and Medicare, potentially adding more retirees and more to the ever-expanding deficit. Then, with bipartisan support, a new piece of Medicare was added, which would provide funding for prescription drugs to Medicare recipients. It's called Medicare Part D. Then a group of Vietnam veterans are going to form a political group called Swift Vote Veterans for Truth. And they're going to run some ads in opposition to John Kerry. The ads are going to criticize him on 2 counts. They're going to be critical of the job he did in Vietnam, and then also some of the rhetoric that he used after the war when he spoke up against the war effort. Although many of the veterans that served with Kerry did support him, this ad will take a toll on his support. He had built up his campaign so much around his military experience such that anything that sowed any doubt in people's minds about his service could be damaging to him. And perhaps what really might have angered some of these veteran groups was some of the anti-war activism that Kerry did. And there would be clips of him talking before a House committee where he would kind of talk disparagingly about some of the human rights issues that were going on in Vietnam. And perhaps he waved too wide a brush in some of those statements. Now, those had been made in the 1970s, so it had been quite a while ago. And ironically, it was sort of a different John Kerry who was indeed taking a firm stand, and his reputation at this point was that he wasn't taking a firm stand. Ironically, though, he was being criticized on both counts because the firm stands that he was taking was a stand that maybe was seen as anti-military. The tide is going to shift as we move to the Republican convention, which is going to happen in late August. So Bush is going to be able to improve his polling standing after this convention. It's going to be helped by speeches by the likes of Rudolph Giuliani and a Democratic senator named Zell Miller from Georgia, who's going to refer to Bush as the right president at the right time while denouncing his own party. So we're going to look at some September polls here, and we're going to see Bush has indeed improved his standing quite a bit as he's ahead in all of these different polls. And in a couple of these, he's even ahead by double digits. Others, it's like mid to high single digits. So I think the lowest lead he has is the Fox News poll, where he's only ahead by 4, but he's got a couple there where he's ahead by 11, both a Time and an ABC Washington Post poll, with the sort of middling ones being these CBS polls at 7 and 9% respectively. So Bush is looking really strong going into September and throughout September. But Iraq is going to continue to be a headache as the effort to rebuild that country after deposing Saddam Hussein is not going to go smoothly. Political, tribal, ethnic, and religious differences that really predated the Hussein regime, those are going to reemerge and challenge any of the new entities that are going to attempt to form a new government and unite the people. So we're also going to have some players causing some havoc. The Iranian regime and Al Qaeda will both try to exert their influence, and they're going to have some success in certain parts of the country, getting some of their allies and proxies into important, prominent positions. And those folks are going to be definitely at odds with the American forces and America's allies. So, since the government of Iraq had been overthrown, many of the people that had the knowledge and the expertise in matters relating to civil life, like things like water, road maintenance, electricity, stuff like that, all those people are going to be gone because everybody that was associated with Saddam Hussein's party was forced out. But that's going to complicate things because now there's nobody with the expertise in any of those matters. So a lot of this stuff that's going to affect people's day-to-day lives are now going to fall apart. And that's going to make life for people in Iraq very difficult and make them less inclined to support any new regime that the U.S. is going to try to help support in their effort to kind of run things and make things go as smoothly as possible. Going into the debates, Kerry's going to be behind Bush, but he's going to have to perform rather well, outperforming expectations in those debates, especially the first one, which is going to be focused on foreign policy. And Bush is going to really struggle to defend his positions. So Kerry's going to score high marks for the way he kind of pokes holes in some of Bush's arguments, and Bush is going to lose some ground for his inability to articulate a good case for his foreign policy efforts. There's not going to be as many battleground states in this election as the ones we looked at in our previous videos. Kerry had to win some states that Gore didn't win, and the southern states that had gone for Clinton in 92 and 96, but not Gore, were not really ideal places for Kerry to appeal to. Kerry was from Massachusetts, so chances are if Gore wasn't able to win those states, we're talking Kentucky, Louisiana, you could even put West Virginia in that, Kerry wasn't likely to have appeal in any of those states, Arkansas, Tennessee. So further complicating things for Kerry, now we have the 2000 census numbers in play. So Democratic states, the ones that Gore won, are going to actually lose some electoral votes compared to the ones that Bush had won in 2000, such that had had Gore won New Hampshire in 2000, he would have ended up winning the presidency. But now, with these new electoral vote numbers, simply winning New Hampshire wouldn't be enough for Kerry. And Kerry did have a shot in New Hampshire, being from the neighboring state of Massachusetts. So that was one Bush state that he was looking to flip, but he would need to flip somewhere else. So the main state that he really was looking at was Ohio. That would become the big battleground. Clinton had won it twice in the 90s. Gore had lost it in 2000, but Kerry thought that he might have had a shot there. And of course, Florida is also going to be an important battleground state, as it's a state that had gone ever so narrowly for Bush under such controversy after that 2000 election. Now, also, there were some states that Gore had narrowly won that Bush is going to hope to win this time, and those are going to include states like Iowa and New Mexico. So those are also going to be battleground states that Kerry is going to hope to defend moving forward in this 2004 election. I've been talking a lot about polls, but there were some concerns that a lot of experts had about polls during this 2004 election. And there were two things that mainly were cited. So 2004 is going to mark the first election where significant numbers of voters were using cell phones as their primary telephone, and sometimes their only phone. So think about that. Like before this, it was very uncommon for people to have a cell phone as their primary phone. But in 2004, it's now a significant enough numbers of people that that's going to make a big difference. And pollsters hadn't figured out how to call people on cell phones. So the voters that had cell phones as their primary phone were not being represented in the polls. And it was assumed that these people who had these cell phones as their primary phones were disproportionately young, anti-war, and more democratic. So there was an assumption that Kerry would do better in the vote than the polls were suggesting, because it was thought that the polls were undercounting this particular group of people, and it was thought that they were big enough where it could sway things a few points towards Kerry's direction when the actual vote happened. The other thing that was a factor here was this concept of the likely voter. Pollsters often try to figure out whether or not a particular person they're talking to is likely to vote by asking them questions that usually are good reflectors of people who normally vote. But in a wartime situation where people are very passionate, a lot of people who may not usually be likely voters may indeed decide that they're going to turn out this time, and they may be a little bit more motivated, a little bit more enthusiastic. And it was thought that that group of people was also disproportionately more likely to vote for Kerry. So the assumption was, if Bush is only ahead by 1 or 2 points, maybe even 3 points, that might actually be a Kerry lead because of these factors of the pollsters undercounting potentially who Kerry supporters were. So let's take a look at the polls from the week before the election. So for the first time here, we have the Real Clear Politics average. So what this is it's a polling aggregate. It's a formula that Real Clear Politics, which is a media organization, they use this formula to basically give you an average of what numerous different pollsters are saying about the election results. So as we can see here, we see Kerry winning in a couple of these polls, but Bush winning in the majority of the polls. And the Real Clear Politics average has Bush ahead by 1.5%. Now, a lot of people after the election sort of misremember that. They thought that Kerry was the one who was ahead of the polls, and that Bush's win ended up defying what the polls said. Actually, the polls would end up being pretty accurate, but what was inaccurate was that assumption that I mentioned earlier. The assumption was that the polls would be inaccurate and that Kerry would outperform them. So when a lot of experts saw Bush with only a 1.5% lead, a lot of people actually thought that meant that Kerry actually had a small lead, because there was this assumption that there were all these voters out there that the polls weren't counting, or they weren't figuring in to their numbers. So, but actually, these polls, like I said, are going to end up being pretty accurate, and certainly the polling average is actually going to be pretty close to what the actual results would be. So here we have the results. Bush gets 50.7% of the vote. Kerry gets 48.3%. So Bush wins the popular vote by a 2.4% margin. So many expected Kerry to outperform his polling numbers. He did not. In fact, Bush slightly outperformed his numbers, but the polls ended up actually being pretty accurate overall. But looking at the Electoral College, we see the states very continuous here. In our earlier videos where we looked at 1992, 96, 2000, we saw states in different regions going in different directions. But here, it's not going to be like that. We're going to see each region of the country voting by party pretty consistently. So the South is going to go Republican, the Great Plains is going to go Republican, the Mountain West is going to go Republican, whereas the Democrats are going to get the Northeast, they're going to get the Upper Midwest, and they're going to get the West Coast. So this is going to be an era where geography is going to define party identity, I think, more than most eras, certainly more than the current era, and more than that era that we had been looking at, like the 70s, 80s, 90s. This is going to be one where each region is going to be solidly behind one party or the other for a period of time. It's also going to be an era where the smaller parties are going to be rather weak. None of those smaller party candidates that we talked about are going to get more than 0.5% of the vote. So they were something of an asterisk in this particular election. Now, let's talk about the states that flipped. So when we talk about New Hampshire, that was the one New England state, the one northeastern state that had been Republican in 2000, but here in 2004, it's going to flip to the Democrats. Likewise, in the Southwest, you had that one Democratic state in the Southwest, New Mexico. In this election, that's going to flip to the Republicans. So it's going to make the colors much more consistent because of that. Iowa is also going to flip. It's going to go Republican in this election. So other than that, the results from 2000 are going to be pretty close to the results in 2004 when it comes to the Electoral College. But we see Bush now getting the majority of the popular vote. Now, he had failed to win the popular vote in 2000. Now he's actually going to get the majority, more than 50% of the vote. And the last time a candidate had got more than 50% of the popular vote was when his father got that in 1988. So Bush is going to have a bit of a mandate, but he's going to have some tough times moving forward in his second term. The Iraq War is going to continue to be a headache for him. We're going to see an economic downturn late in his second term. So the Republicans are going to lose control of Congress moving forward, and we're going to get some different political dynamics as a result of that. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a like. Check out my earlier videos in the presidential election series or some of the other topics that I cover here. And, if you have any ideas, any thoughts you want to share, feel free to add your thoughts to the comments or share this video with anybody you know. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the rest of your day.